Hi everyone, welcome back to Workout Wednesday, Power BI edition. My name is Shannon Lindsay and I am going to take you through this week's challenge. This week we are working with Unicode characters in Power BI and we are continuing to work with the Nobel Prize data set. If this is your first week joining us, do not worry, you can start from scratch here. If you have been following along with the Nobel Prize dataset challenges, you can build on your previous challenges. We will use the same API call that Megan used last week. Let's briefly review the requirements before we jump in. So the first thing we're going to do is to retrieve the data from the Nobel Prize website. We're then going to create a dimension table using Unicode values so that we get these icons or emojis, whatever these are, in our report. Those Unicode values are provided on the website. You can also use different Unicode characters of your choosing. The next requirement is to create this slicer, a nice horizontal slicer where we can insert the Unicode values. We will then use DAX to translate them into the unichar. I do not know how to say that word. We do want to make sure that the slicer is single select and that it is horizontal. The next thing we're going to do is to create a dynamic title for your page. So you can see that the title changes along with the selection in the slicer. We're going to add these card visuals to display a little bit of data. And then finally, we are going to display a bar chart. So let's get started with retrieving the data. To retrieve the data from the Nobel Prize website, we are simply going to pass in the following URL using the web connector in Power BI. In a new Power BI workbook, we are going to get data, and we are going to get data from the web. Here, we're going to pass in the URL for the API call. Click OK. And Power BI, specifically Power Query, is now going to go out to the web to retrieve this data, and we will then see it in the Power Query editor. All right, so as you can see, a lot has happened here, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh this preview just to make sure we have the most recent data. And what Power BI has done here is it has applied some steps to the data, which comes in JSON format. Power Query has applied a number of different steps, assuming that it knows what we want to do with the data. So there are a couple of different things that we can do here to explore. The first thing that I like to do is just to sort of step through the different steps to see what is happening to the data where. So for example, if we look at the source step, what you'll see here is that Power BI is bringing back the contents of this API call in the format of a JSON document. And what you can do is just step through the different steps to see what is happening at each step. This is a great way to start to learn some of the M language. Just one quick note, if your window does not look like mine, you can go to the View tab of the ribbon, turn on the formula bar, and then you'll be able to see the M that's being written behind the scenes. Before we step through all of these steps together, the main thing I want to mention is that we need to understand what are the fields that we're going to need for our visualization. Now, just because Power BI can do something doesn't necessarily mean that it should. And so I would like to actually start from scratch and not use this auto-generated table. Now, there's no reason why you can't, except you're going to have to do some digging around in here and some exploring to make sure that you get all of the columns that you need. So I'm actually just going to go all the way up to the step right after the source step here. And I'm going to right click on Convert it to Table. And we're just going to step through this together so that we are all on the same page. So I'm going to right click on Convert it to Table. And I am just going to delete until the end. And then what you're going to see is that we'll go from, having 20 plus steps in our query to having far fewer steps. Now, in a small-ish data set like this, the number of steps really isn't going to affect the performance too much. And this, when I say affect performance, this will affect the time that it takes to refresh the data. But we're not necessarily worried about that, but I just want to clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to go through these steps somewhat quickly, and you are welcome to, kind of rewatch the video or, pause or slow down. First thing that we're going to do is we are going to convert this into a table. You'll notice that that little convert tab pops up at the top. The next thing I'm going to do is I am just going to grab the laureates from the list. And what you'll see here is that we're going to get back another list of records, and we're going to convert this to a table again. From here, what you're going to see are the contents of the table. We're going to click OK, just using the default values. And one more time, we're going to expand. We're going to expand this column 1. I'm going to deselect use original column name as prefix. And here I'm going to be a little bit selective. So I am going to ditch the ID column. I'm going to keep the known name. I'm going to deselect the given name and the family name. I'm also going to deselect the full name. I'm going to keep the file name. You'll see why in just a bit. I want the gender. I want the birth. I'm going to deselect Wikipedia, Wikidata, same as. I don't need any links. Nobel Prizes I'm going to keep, and I'm going to keep the death information. So now what you'll see is we're getting a little bit closer to what it is that we want. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go left to right here and start manipulating this data. Now, if you're confused about what is in each record or what is in each list, a nice little trick is just to click in the blank space next to the record itself, and you'll see what's in there. So here I've got 2 records, one that is in English and one that is in Spanish. They appear to be the same here, but that just shows you what's inside each of these things. So I'm going to go ahead and expand the name so that we are extracting the value. I'm only going to bring back the English column because we don't need it in 2 languages. This is going to then populate the English column. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, you could do it as an additional step, which would be to I want to rename this column. You could do it as an additional step, but I'm actually going to be brave, and I'm going to come in here and I am going to rename it myself. And I'm just going to call this name. Okay, so I am just fussing around with the M code. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is here you'll see we've got our column profiling turned on, and you can see that 3% of these values are empty. Well, if I scroll down here a little bit, you'll notice that the values that are empty are those that are actually held by organizations. So for example, in this year, whichever year this was, the Friends Committee won the prize. Okay, so what we're going to do later is we're going to create a conditional column to combine those two and fill in so that everything is in one column. We're not going to quite do that yet. So the next thing we're going to do is just to expand the birth, the Nobel Prize, and the death column. So I know that I want the birth date. I'm going to use my same trick as last time where I'm going to rename this to birth date just so that I don't get anything confused. Now again here I renamed it without adding an additional step. You could add an additional step and just double click and type the name that you want. It is pick your poison here. This, I believe, is slightly more efficient, although I'm not 100% sure. We're then going to expand the Nobel Prize data. We're going to expand this to new rows. And here again, we have the opportunity to look at the records. So I'm going to expand this. We're going to get the column names that are inside, and there are a few columns of interest here. So I want to look at the award year. We want to know the category. We want to know the date awarded. We want to know the motivation. This is the reason why they received the Nobel Prize. And you could also theoretically look at the prize amount or any affiliations, but this is what I'm going to bring back for now. You can see here that we still have some more kind of nested values. We need to get out the category and the motivation. I'm going to just follow the same procedure. So I am going to expand the category column and also the motivation column. From the category, all we need here is the name in English. So category, whether it's the Peace Prize or physics or whatever the prize is. I'm then going to do the same thing with my motivation column. Bring back the English. And finally with the death column. And this will get us our death date. Okay, so we are getting closer to what we need to create our visualization, but we have a few things we need to clean up here. The first thing that jumps out to me are these columns that are not completely full. So columns that have blank values in them. I know from the data that some will have blank values in them, but most should not. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to create a conditional column to say if the name column is blank, then give me back the file name. And actually, looking at this, I think there's one more step I want to do before I do this. I am going to go ahead and just format this so that the text is capitalized, just so that this looks a little bit cleaner in the front end. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a column. I'm going to add a conditional column, and Power Query makes it really simple for us. You don't have to write any code. You just specify your if statements. So here we're going to call this, I don't know, full name. And we are going to say if the name column is blank, then give us back the file name column, else give us back the name column. All right, and now you can see we have no empty values. I'm going to go ahead and remove the two columns that I don't need. Now that's something that's really neat about Power Query. After the steps have been applied, you can remove columns that you do not need to keep your model nice and tidy. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to do is I am just interested in these dates here. I noticed that the award year is more complete than the date awarded, so I'm going to go ahead and use this for the to turn this into a date as well. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to select, let's see if we can do these all at once. I'm going to select birth date, award year, and date. And this is actually the death date. We did not rename that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to where I expanded the death date. And I am just going to rename this death date. I also could have just double clicked in there and renamed. Either one works. Okay, I'm then going to jump back down to my final step. And now we're going to go ahead and format these as dates. Now, dates in Power Query are pretty slick. They're pretty simple. In these date columns, we have the year, the month, and then the day. So in order to format this properly as a date, we cannot just click on the data type here and format it as a date. That will not necessarily work because that uses the date settings of your operating system. What we want to do is set the date using a locale, but we're going to do, oops, sticky cursor. We're going to do all three of these columns at the same time. We're going to change the type. We're going to change the type using a locale. And here we're going to go ahead and change the type with the locale, and we need to specify that this is indeed a date. And rather than English US, I am going to select English UK. Now, there are many options in here, and depending on the format of the date as it comes in, you will be able to very clearly see which one you need to use. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to go with English UK. I'm going to click OK. And this gives me what I need. It put the award year all into a date format. I've got my death dates. Just at a glance, it looks like this is working properly. And then I have something strange here. I've got an error here in the birth date column, and I want to do a little investigation and see what's going on here. So, unsurprisingly, the issue here is that the source data is not formatted as an actual date. So this is 1943-0000. Now, we're just going to replace those errors with nulls or ignore them. All right, so we are nearly there. The next thing that we want to do is just to take this gender column and let's go ahead and capitalize the first letter of the column, just so that this is clear to the readers. We're not going to create a dimension table for that for this report. We're going to transform this. We are going to capitalize each word. And then we've got one more little fill in that we need to do here. And in this case, what you'll see is that for the folks who are an organization winning rather than an individual, you'll see that the gender is null. And I want to replace those nulls with the word organization. So I am going to just do a little right click here. I am going to replace values. You could also do this on the transform tab of the ribbon. And I am going to find null and I'm going to replace it with the word organization. Okay, we are nearly there. I'm going to very quickly here, we're just going to rename this, and I'm going to just rename it week 25 NP data. The next thing we need to do is to get those Unicode values into our report so that we can put those nice little icons in the slicer. And we're going to go ahead on the home tab of the ribbon, we're going to create a new table here. And we are going to go ahead and just manually enter data. Just by clicking on enter data. There are a couple of different ways that you can create your dimensions, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to do this one manually. And the beautiful thing about this is you can just copy and paste. Now, I got these Unicode values, I searched for them online. They were fairly easy to find, and these may not be, perfectly accurate as far as what represents physics, but we need these values so that we can then use DAX to create the Unicode characters. Once you have created this table, you will see that at your source step, it's using some binary encoding to get a table from rows, but if you want to amend your table or make any changes, you can simply click on the little gear icon. Okay, that was a lot of Power Query, but I'm really pleased with what we ended up with. We now have 8 columns. We have, 15 steps as opposed to many steps as we had before, and we are ready to build. We are going to close and apply. We're going to load this data to the model, and we're going to get started. Before we get started, we need to make sure that our data model is formatted properly so we have the correct relationships between the tables. Now, what you can see here is I did not create any relationships. Power BI actually created this for me. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete it so that we can create it from scratch. If your column names are the same and if you have the feature enabled, generally the relationship will be created for you, but let's go ahead and just manually create it. So the first way you can do it is you can drag category from your dimension table to category in your fact table, or alternatively, you can go to the Manage Relationships tab of the ribbon. You can create a new relationship. We're going to start from our dimension. We're going to grab our category column. We're also going to select it in our data. It is a one-to-many relationship, meaning there is one appearance of the category in our dimension table. There are many in our fact table. I'm going to click OK, and you'll then see that that relationship is created. The next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we have all of the metrics of interest in our data. So if you'll remember correctly, we're going to be looking at the number of laureates. We're going to look at the proportion of laureates who are women. We're also looking at the average age at award and age at death. So we have some dates in here. We have a birth date, an award date, award year, and award date. We also have a death date. So you'll see here that it is not blank for all. It's only blank for some of the ones at the top. So these are the columns we're going to use to create those calculations. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a measure, and there are many different ways you can do this. I am going to forego creating a measures table just for this example, and I'm just going to go ahead and right click anywhere in my table and create a new measure. The first thing that we're going to do is just the count of the laureates. So how many Nobel Prize winners, distinct Nobel Prize winners, did we have? So I am, in lieu of creating an index or using the ID column in Power Query, I'm going to go ahead and do a distinct count of full name. So there are a number of different ways you can do this, but that's how we're going to start. And I'm just going to make this bigger so we can see it. I'm going to call this laureates, and this is going to be a distinct count of the what is this column called, of the full name. Okay, now this could get you into trouble for a couple of different reasons. If there is a name that is in the column more than once, but it's spelled slightly different, or it has a different, I don't know, one has an accent and one does not, this could get you into trouble. So typically I would create an index column, but we did not do that here. So we're just going to go ahead and find our distinct count of the full name. Now, I occasionally, when I'm building, I like to do a little sanity check of my measures as I'm building. I know what to expect. I've built this before. So what I like to do is to create I call it a troubleshooting tab. You can call it whatever you want. I go ahead and hide the tab, or the page rather, and I'm just going to drop my new measure onto the page, format it as a card, so I know exactly what I'm working with. The next thing that we need to do is to calculate the proportion of laureates that are female. There are a couple of different ways that we can do this, but for today we are going to use the divide function, and we're going to divide the number of laureates who are female over the total number of laureates which we just calculated. So I'm going to jump back into my data view. You can do this anywhere. You don't have to be in the data view, but I do like to build measures here. I'm going to create a new measure, and this is going to be the proportion, or the percent of female laureates who are women. And here what we're going to do is we're going to use a divide function. Now in Power Query, it is much more efficient to use a divide function than to actually, you can use the actual slash to do a division calculation, but it's more efficient to use divide. This is a best practice. So we're going to go ahead and divide, and we're going to do a little bit of nesting here. We're going to do a calculate function. Remember, calculate function filters your results over an iterator. So I'm going to calculate the number of laureates. That's my expression, which we calculated before. Here you can see how our measures are building on each other. And here I'm going to calculate the number of laureates where the gender is equal to female. So I'm going to get my week 25 data. I did not name this query very well, but we will look past that. And we're going to say where the gender is equal to female. Now, I forgot the quotation marks. All right, so this is the numerator of our divide function. Now we're going to go ahead and add the denominator, and the denominator is the total number of laureates. So again, we're going to use that measure we already had created. I'm going to close this parenthesis. I already did that. And I'm going to push enter. I do always want to make sure that I'm formatting this properly. So this is going to be a %, and we're going to go ahead and put no 0 decimal points there. I'm going to jump back to my troubleshooting tab, and I'm going to drop another card visual onto the page. I'll do it slightly different this time. And again, I know what to expect. 6% of the laureates are female. The next thing that we need to do is to define the age at award and the age at death. Now we're going to do this right now using a calculated column. This is a fast way to do it. It's a bit of a ballpark figure. It's probably a best practice to use the age calculation in Power Query, but for the purposes of today, we're going to go ahead and create a calculated column for each of these. And what we're going to do is do a date diff. We're going to use the date diff function to look at the difference in dates between the birth date and then either the award year or the death date. Now, calculated columns should be used with caution. This is a small model, and that's what we're going to do. The first thing I want to check, though, is just to make sure that my date columns are formatted correctly. So birth date is formatted as a date, award year is formatted as a date, and death date is the last one that I need. Also formatted as a date. Okay, so we're good. I'm going to go ahead and add a new column. The first thing we're going to add is the age at award. Alrighty, so we are going to calculate the age at award, and this is going to be equal to, and we're going to use the date diff function. I have to spell it properly in order for it to pull up. The first date that we're going to look at is the birth date, right? Because we want to know what's the difference between the birth date and the award date. So we are going to drop in the birth date. I'm having a hard time spelling today. We're going to get up the week 25 NP data, terribly named. So that is our first date. We're then going to look at the award year. which is formatted as a date. And so again, we're going to pull up the week 25 NP data award year. And actually, we're going to go ahead and go with date awarded rather than award year. I'm just clicking in here to cross-check that it's, oh, that is formatted as text. Okay, so we are going to use award year. Now, this is not incredibly precise. It's precise enough for this exercise, but I would probably do this a little bit differently if I were doing this in the wild. But here we're going to take the award year, and then the interval or the format that we want to get the date back in is the year. Okay, so this is going to give us our age at award. And you'll see here, because it's a calculated column, you do get this preview of what comes back in the date. You will notice that for the, of course, for the records that are blank for the birth date, of course, the age at award is blank. Oftentimes that's for an organization rather than an individual, but it may be not. The next thing we're going to do is the exact same thing, and we're going to calculate the age at death. We are now ready to start building our report. The first thing that we need to do according to the requirements is to go ahead and use our Unicode value to create our icon in our dimension table. We're actually going to do this as a calculated column in our dimension table. We're going to add a calculated column, and we're going to use the unicar DAX formula. So what we're going to do is name this. We'll just call this icon. So the icon is equal to the unicar, and we're going to add the number is our column that has the Unicode value. From here, what you're going to see when you push enter is that you've got the icon in a column of its own. This is what we're going to need to format our slicer. So we're going to go back to the report page. We're going to add in a slicer. Oh, and I always do like to start by making sure that my page background is set up the way that I want it. It always defaults to 100. Bring that down to 0. We're then going to add our slicer. Now, we don't want these default settings, so what we're going to do is add our field of interest. We're then going to go to the formatting paint roller, and we're going to set this up exactly the way that we want it. So if you select the formatting paint roller, we're going to start by going to selection controls, and we do not want multi-select turned on, so we're going to enable single select. We only want to be able to see one category at a time. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to make this a horizontal rather than a vertical or a drop-down slicer. So we're going to change this to horizontal. This makes it look and feel a little bit more like a button rather than just a drop-down list where you're selecting. You can see here that we've got the icons in the slicer. We're close to what we want, but we actually need to go ahead and increase the font size. Default font size is too small. This is all pretty customizable. You can customize the font color. You can also customize the background color. So what color, it is when you have the value selected. And we're going to go ahead and just increase the font size so that they are readable. And the next thing we're going to do is turn that title off. So we do not have the title turned on. The next piece of the puzzle is to create a dynamic title for the report page. So there are a number of different ways that you can do this, but we're going to actually go ahead and insert a text box. So we're not going to, you could just use a DAX formula, you could use the Smart Narrative visual, or you can just add a text box. So we're going to give this a title. We're going to call it Nobel Prize Laureates 4, and then we're going to add a value. And here in the value, we're just going to type in the word category. And that is going to fulfill what we needed to fulfill for our dynamic selection. Go ahead and click Save. And notice that the category changes when you select the icon in the slicer, which is pretty neat. We're going to go ahead and make the font bigger on this bad boy so that we can actually see it. And we're going to move it into place. Center the text as always. Drop this where it needs to be. And when you're playing around with the formatting here, I always like to use the built-in formatting options where you can center things, you can distribute things. It looks really similar to how it looks in PowerPoint. They call this PowerPoint for data now. So you can customize things as much or as little as you want to. You know, as a data viz best practice, using the out-of-the-box visuals, the out-of-the-box font sizes, those are not going to serve you well. They're not going to be best for your readers. Now, the next thing we need to do is to add our 3 card visuals. So the first card visual we're going to add is the % of women laureates or % of female laureates. We're going to go ahead and make sure that this is formatted the way we want it to be. And do note, when you're adding your new card visuals, if you have a slicer selected, filters are being applied. So just keep that in mind. Now I'm noticing as we're applying the filters, my font size is too big in the title. So we're going to jump back in and fix that. We need to make the font size a little bit smaller, and I want to get rid of that scroll bar on the right-hand side. That does not serve anyone well. Then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to center this bad boy, and then we'll adjust our other visuals accordingly. Okay, now back to our card visuals. The next 2 card visuals we're going to add are the average age at award and the average age at death. So you can either copy and paste this, or you can add a new card visual by selecting it from the visualizations pane. I'm going to move it into place. And here we're going to use the simple, easy, perhaps it's the lazy way of doing things, but we're going to use what's called an implicit measure. So when you click on the little drop down of the value, you're going to get some options for calculations. Okay, and here we're going to go ahead and use the average. Now, one thing to note about these implicit measures is that if you use an implicit measure, meaning that DAX is created behind the scenes by Power BI, you can only use that measure in this one visual. So if it's a metric that you're going to need to reuse, this is not a best practice. However, if you know it's something you're only going to use one time, it's not affecting the performance of the report. This is an acceptable way to do that. Now, in order to format this, rather than doing it up in the ribbon, because it's calculating behind the scenes, you need to set the decimal places to 0 in the formatting paint roller. So now we've got our average age at award, and I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this so that our average age at death is formatted in the exact same way. Now, we could just as easily add a new measure where the average age at award is equal to the average of the age at award column. But for this exercise, we're just going ahead and using the implicit measure for both average age at award and average age at death. I'm going to go ahead and rename this so that it appears correctly. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of formatting here. We're going to center our average age at award. That did not work. Let's try this again. Center the average age at award. And then the next thing I want to do is to format these a little bit. We're going to actually select them all and right click and group them. And we're then going to add a background to the grouping. You could also theoretically put a shape behind it, but if you do that, then another visual has to render. So it's a best practice to go ahead and group and add a background if you're not doing some kind of an image as a background. The next thing we need to do is to create our bar chart. We are going to create our bar chart displaying the number of laureates by year and type. All right, so when you are building any new visuals, the most difficult part when you're first learning is just making sure that you know where the fields are being dragged and dropped. So the first thing I always like to set is what is being displayed on the axis. So we are looking at the award year on the axis. And you can see that the default formatting is being applied here. So we've got award year dropping into our title and into the title of the x-axis. We will remove that in the formatting. And we can also we can customize the way that these appear. Alrighty, so we are now going to very quickly adjust the formatting of this visual. So I'm not going to walk through every single step, but what we're going to do is we're going to use the formatting paint roller to remove the titles on the axes. We're going to increase the font size. We're going to move the legend down to become centered, and we're also going to turn the title off. So we're going to just fast forward through this, but go ahead and do all of this formatting in the formatting paint roller. Last but not least, we are going to adjust our tooltip. So you can see this is the default tooltip, and what you see in the default tooltip are the fields that exist in the visual. So if you click on the visual, you go to the formatting paint, you go to the visual itself, you can see the fields that exist in there. You also have the opportunity to drag in additional fields, but you're not able to change the formatting. So the best way to get around this is to go ahead and add what we call a report page tooltip. I'm going to rename the tab so that I don't get confused. We like to keep things nice and organized. I'm going to add an additional tab. I'm going to call it Tooltip. You can call it whatever you want. The tab will not be displayed, so the naming is entirely up to you. Then the next thing we're going to do is set the information to Tooltip, and we're going to select the size to be tooltip sized. Now, once you start creating these tooltips, you may see that the default size is not exactly what you want. You can change it later. Okay, then you're going to go to the View tab of the ribbon to view this so that it fits the screen so you can see what you're doing in there. That initial view is just showing you the size that the report page tooltip will appear. Okay, so now we're just going to go ahead and we're going to add a table onto the canvas, and we're going to add the awardee's name, their age, and their motivation, or why they won the Nobel Prize. You'll see here again the default formatting, and I'm going to go ahead and just change the name, the title of the name column. I am now looking for my motivation column, and I actually can see it exists there, but I failed to rename it in Power Query. You can make up for this mistake. You can double click on the column name and rename it here. Note that this will apply that change back in Power Query. So if you rename it here, it is renamed indeed. I'm going to add the motivation column in. And just a quick note about formatting. To format this table, to adjust the column size, you need to hover over the header, and then you need to drag. I'm going to go ahead and make this tooltip a little bit wider by selecting a custom size, and I'm just going to increase the width here so that our users of the report can read what they're looking at. Again, I'm going to add my column that I need. So we're going to add the age column, the age at award, and then we're just going to do some final formatting for our report page tooltip. The final piece of the puzzle here is to come back to our report page and to enable the report page tooltip on the visual of interest. So we're going to select the visual. We're going to go to the formatting paint roller. We're going to scroll down to tooltip, open that up. It is going to be a report page tooltip, and then you're going to denote which page of your report is the tooltip. And then what you're going to see is when you hover over your visual, you're going to see the information that you need. Now, if your tooltip is not appearing here, do make sure that you have the page information set on the tooltip page. This week was a long one. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We will see you here next week, same time, same place.